have a to-do list application here with some authentication, so a user can either sign up or log in, and when they do, they will access their to-do list, which they can add items to, and so on. Now, the to-do list is unique to each user, so if I log out and log in as another user, then they will see a different to-do list. Now, what I would like to do here is provide an API for this application, and I already have one set up like I show in episode 350 at API/tasks, and right now it returns some JSON which lists all of the tasks in the database, but I don't want this because to-do lists are meant to be private. So what I need to do is add a layer of authentication to this API so that it can only manage tasks for the user that has granted permission to it. Now, there are many ways that we can lock down an API like I show in episode 352, and the solution that'll work best in this application is OAuth, specifically oauth2. Now, even though oauth2 is still in draft form, it's used by many large applications such as Facebook and GitHub. Now, to integrate oauth2 into our application, I'll be using the Doorkeeper gem. This is a Rails engine which makes it very easy to turn our app into an oauth2 provider. However, it does rely on Active Record currently, so be aware of that. The contributors to Doorkeeper have done an excellent job in providing several example applications. I'll link to these in the show notes and you can try these out to experiment with how it works. Alright, let's get down to business and use Doorkeeper to turn this application into an oauth2 provider. First off, I'm going to make a quick configuration change in this application because I found some conflicts with Doorkeeper and this whitelist attribute setting in my application config file. I'm going to set this to false here. I'm sure this will be fixed soon in a new version. So with that little change, now I can just go into my gem file, and at the bottom here I'll add the Doorkeeper gem, and then you'll need to run the bundle command to install it. Next, run the Rails generate Doorkeeper install command that is provided by the gem. So this created several files, which I'll take a look at in a minute, and added a line to our routes file to mount the engine. It also provided some instructions for adjusting the configuration and telling us to migrate the database. I'll migrate the database now. Notice this migration created several tables for managing the applications that can connect to your API and how they can access it. Next, let's take a look at the main configuration file that was generated. It's under config initializers doorkeeper.rb. This file is well commented, so you can read that to learn about the different configuration options. The only one that we really have to change here at the moment is this resource owner authenticator block, and right now it just raises an exception, but we don't want to do that. Instead, we want it to either return the current user or redirect as shown in this example. Now this will pretty much work for us where it just finds the current user based off of the session user ID, which happens to be the way the authentication works in this application, or redirects to the, this is actually going to be a different URL, which is the login URL in this application, but you can change it to whatever authentication URL you want to log the user in. So now after restarting my application, I can test out some of the functionality that Doorkeeper provides. Currently you can see I'm not logged in, so let's try visiting the oauth/authorize URL path provided by Doorkeeper. Notice when I visited that, it ended up triggering that configuration block, which did a redirect because I'm currently not logged in. So let's try logging in and then visiting that oauth/authorize URL path again, and this time I get an error saying unknown client. And this is because Doorkeeper doesn't know what application the user is trying to authorize here. We first need to set up an application under oauth/applications, and here Doorkeeper provides a nice sort of scaffold type interface for creating an application. So I'll just make one here to try things out. I'll just call it test client. And we also need to provide a URL it should redirect to after the user's done authorizing it. And I don't really have an application set up yet, but when I do, I'm going to have it running under the URL of localhost port 3001, and it'll be auth/todo/callback. And then I'll create this application. So now with this setup, we can fully test out OAuth with these credentials, but it really helps to have some kind of OAuth client to interact with this provider. Now the oauth2 gem will help us out here. It allows us to easily interact through the oauth2 protocol using Ruby, and the README provides some nice instructions for acting as an oauth2 client, and this will work great for testing out Doorkeeper. First, I'll install the gem called oauth2, and then I'll start up IRB and require that oauth2 gem. Now the client will need each of these values, so I'm just going to copy and paste them into variables in the REPL. I'll just name the first one callback and set it to that URL. And then we have our app ID, which is that string. And then we have our secret, which is that string. So now we can use the gem to set up the client. So that's under oauth2 client.new, and then pass in our app ID and secret value. And also we need to specify the site URL, which is the site we're trying to connect to, which is at localhost port 3000. And then we can determine the URL to direct the user to by calling client.authcode.authorize URL, and then pass in a redirect URI option, which should be that callback URL, which should match the same URL we specified when we created the application. So now we have this URL for authorizing this client, and notice it's at oauth/authorize, which is the same path we tried to visit earlier, but this time we have a client ID passed in, along with a number of other options for fully authorizing this app over oauth2. So I'll just paste in this URL, and this is where you would send the user to authorize the client. And now it says authorize test client to use your account. I'll say authorize. So now we get this error that says Safari can't connect to the server, but that's expected because it redirected us to localhost port 3001, which would be our client application, but we don't have a server running under that yet. Instead, we're just testing this out through the terminal. So what that would do, that callback URL would take this code and generate a proper OAuth access token from it. So back in the terminal, we can generate that access token by calling client.authcode.getToken and passing in that code which was returned in the URL callback. And we can also need to pass in a redirect URI option again here for the callback URL. And let's try this out. Looks like that worked. That returned an access token object, which we can call token on to see our actual token string. And this should stay good for 2 hours and expire after that with Doorkeeper's default settings. So with all of this in place, our client is now able to interact with our application's API on the user's behalf. So if I go to localhost port 3000/API/tasks, and again here, this is returning all of the tasks, and this is all still public. So what I would like to do here is restrict this to only allow access if the user is coming through OAuth. So going into the controller that's generating that API, I just need to call doorkeeper for and pass in all here to restrict all actions inside of this controller to require them go through OAuth. Now if I try reloading this API page in the browser, I get an empty response. But if you check out the headers of this response, you can see the status code is 401 unauthorized, which is what we expect because we haven't gone through OAuth through the browser here. To get this to work, I can pass in an access token parameter and just paste in the access token which was returned through the terminal, and now it will give me access to the API because I'm going through OAuth. However, this is still returning all the tasks. Instead, I want to show only the tasks for the user that authorize the access. So back in the tasks controller, I need to change this index action to only fetch the tasks for that given user. Now, Doorkeeper provides this method called Doorkeeper token, which is actually an active record model instance, which has some information about the token that the user is accessing the page through. And there's a method called resource owner ID, which will return the ID for the object which you return through that configuration block, which is the user's ID. So we can do user.find based off of that resource owner ID to fetch the current user. And then we can call user.tasks to grab those tasks. So now reloading this page just returns the tasks for the user which authorized access through OAuth. Now you'll probably be doing this quite a bit through various API controller actions, so you'll want to share this behavior. I usually override the current user method at the API controller level, so this way, under API controllers, the current user will fetch the current user through Doorkeeper, but everything else outside of the API will just use the cookie or session or whatever else you have set up in the application controller. So now I can use this method in the index action and in the create action to just create tasks through that user. Now let's make sure this still works by reloading this page in the browser, and it does, but you probably won't be interacting with the API much through the browser. Instead, how do we interact with our API through Ruby code? Well, the oauth2 gem can help us out with this as well. On that access token object that we got back, we can call various get, post, put, and delete methods on this and pass in a path such as API/tasks, and then fetch the tasks through that. Now this returns a response object, which we can call parsed on, for example, and this will parse the JSON for us and return an array, in this case, in Ruby. We can try creating a task as well by submitting a post request to that same path, API/tasks, and we can also pass a params hash inside of here. So we can say the task name should be set to, let's say, test oauth. Let's create that, and it looks like it worked. Let's see the parsed response, and we get all the list of tasks, including the test oauth task here. So this gem is really awesome and might be all you need to create a client for authenticating over OAuth and communicating with your API. Now, if you're setting up a Rails application as an oauth2 client, consider using OmniAuth like I show in episode 241. Now, if you check out the Doorkeeper wiki, you can find documentation on creating an OmniAuth strategy. It's pretty easy just to copy this class here and fill in the values relevant to your provider, changing the name, the URL, and so on. Now, OmniAuth does expect there to be some way to fetch additional information about the user through the API, which you can see here for getting raw information about the user. We call access token get somepath.parsed. So access token here is using that oauth2 gem that I showed you in the terminal. Now, currently my application doesn't provide any user info through the API, so I'm going to need to add that before I can set up OmniAuth as a client. Now I'm going to run through this quickly because it's pretty basic. In the routes file for this application in the API path, I'm just going to make a new match here for the user path and map this to the user's show action. So I need to make this user's controller next. So under API version 1, make a user's controller.rb. Now I'm just going to paste in the code for this controller class. It's using Doorkeeper as well here, and it has a show action which responds with JSON format, displaying the current user's detail, except for the password digest column because I obviously don't want to include that. Now I am using the current user method here, which is defined in the tasks controller. So I'm also going to make a base controller here, which I'll define under here, called base controller.rb. And I'll paste in the code for this as well, just a class where we can define some shared logic, such as the current user method, which is similar to how I defined it in the task controller here, so I can delete it here and have the task controller also inherit from base controller. So now I have a user's controller which will return information about the user. And we could try this out through the oauth2 gem in the terminal with the access token.get, and that's at API/user route, and calling parsed on this will return that hash of attributes for that given user. So this is exactly what we need to do in our OmniAuth strategy to generate that raw info hash. Now off camera, I've created this client-side app using OmniAuth similar to how I show in episode 241. Notice it's running on port 3001, but I suggest setting this up with POW if you need multiple Rails applications to interact with each other. Now, this client app has a link here for signing in through the to-do list provider app, and when I click this, it's going to sign me in instantly because I, as a user, have already authorized this application when I signed in through the command line. So if I click it now, it's going to sign me in instantly and grab my credentials through the API. Now, this client app has the same functionality as the provider app, but is interacting through the API. I use that to fetch the tasks, and if I create a task, that works as well through the API. Now let's quickly take a look through the source code of this client app to understand how it works. Now inside of the gem file for this app, I'm just including the OmniAuth oauth2 gem, which I'll use for defining the strategy, and that's under the lib directory here. I defined a to-do list strategy for that provider, where I specify the URL, and including the username and the info, and gathering that user info from the user API path that we set up earlier. So this provider is set up under the config initializers directory under omniauth.rb. I'm loading in that strategy and specifying it as a provider here, and I'm just passing in the ID and secret for this app under the environment variables. So when the user signs in, the sessions controller create action gets triggered, and this I just create a new user or find the existing one that matches that ID, and I store that user information and the access token, which is under the auth credentials token field, so that we can access the API. Now you might want to store this access token somewhere else, such as in the user database, but I just decided to keep it in a session here. Now inside of the tasks controller is where the API magic is going on. Now in the index action here, I'm fetching the tasks through the access token that the oauth2 gem provides, and I'll show you how I'm grabbing this a little bit later. I'm calling get on this on that API task path, parsing it, and using that to display the tasks in the view. And the create action does something similar, just calling post on this, passing in the task name parameter, and then redirecting back to the list. Now the application controller is the big one. This is where the access token method is provided that's used in the tasks controller, and this just creates a new access token based off of the OAuth client, which is created here. So this is doing something similar to what we did inside of the REPL. And also I have a rescue from clause here to rescue from the oauth2 error in case we get an unauthorized exception. This is likely due because of the token has expired. So this will clear out the user session and redirect them back with an error message asking them to try signing in again. Alright, so that's how you build an OAuth client app and interact with the API. Now there are probably some gems to help improve this client app, but here I'm focusing more on the provider and the OAuth interaction. Now there are a few more things left to do on the provider app to improve the experience. For example, what if I try signing out of each of these applications and then try signing in again? Well, I get the login screen on the provider app, which is what I expect. But if I try signing in here, then it'll bring me to the to-do list on the provider app and not try to finish the sign-in process that the client was going on. Fixing this is pretty easy. I just need to go to my doorkeeper configuration in the provider app, and this is where I'm redirecting to the login URL if they aren't signed in. And I can pass in additional options in here, such as a return to URL, which will be the request.fullpath. So this way it'll come back here when the user logs in. But I also need to change the sessions controller to handle this, which I've already done off camera here, just storing the return to URL in a session parameter, and then redirecting to that after the user logs in and resetting it to nil. So now with that change, when I try signing in through the client app, it includes the URL to return to, and I can try completing the sign-in process. Then it's going to go to that URL, complete the OAuth authentication, and redirect me back to the client app. Now another thing we should do on the provider app is restrict access to the OAuth apps. So the applications interface here, you probably don't want it available to the public so anyone can add an app. Well, that's what this admin authenticator block is for. We can authorize the user in any way we want. I'm just going to basically do the same thing as I am here, except instead of checking if it's a user, I'm just going to see if its user ID is equal to 1, just to keep things simple, but you can do whatever you want here. Now with that change, if I'm not logged in as a first user and I try visiting OAuth applications, it redirects me to the login page. Or if I log in as my user, then I go to the applications. It works. Now there's so much more that Doorkeeper provides that I haven't covered here, such as authorization scopes, which is basically a way to restrict what an OAuth client is able to do. It's really cool. I recommend you check out the wiki documentation for more details on that. I want to finish up with a quick note about security. Even though I've been using plain HTTP here, it's very important that you use a secure connection when working with OAuth. In other words, use HTTPS when communicating with your API. Well, that's it for this episode on using Doorkeeper to make an OAuth provider. This way users can sign in through your application, and then this way they can grant permission to another application to access the API. Thanks for watching. I hope you find it useful.